Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just want to remind you that we're still welcoming some suggestions for food for thought speakers for later this year, and also the beginning of next year now. So please drop us an email if you've got any suggestions. I'll pop our email in the Q&A once I finish my introduction. And we've got lots of great speakers coming up, for which we will send out a flyer in due course. Today's talk is on unlocking unrealised regulatory and business potential of food chain information through digital convergence, and it's from Sonal Choudhary and Raymond Obayi. Dr. Choudhary is the Head of Operations Management and Decision Sciences Research Centre and an Associate Professor in Sustainable Management at Sheffield University Management School. She specialises in sustainable operations and supply chain management practices, along with technological adoptions for enhancing the resilience and sustainability of food systems. Dr. Obayi is a researcher and lecturer in project operations and supply chain management and works at the Alliance Manchester Business School. He's the food policy liaison in the UKRI SDFC Food Network Phase 2 project and significantly contributed to the SDFC FCA's 21st Century Abattoirs Review. So before I hand over to the speakers, in terms of housekeeping, since we're on Teams Live, you won't be able to unmute your microphone to ask questions, but you will be able to post those in the Q&A to the right of your screen. Feel free to post questions whenever you like, but please note that we won't cover these until the end of the talk, when Sarah will read them out for the speakers to answer. And finally, to note that this seminar is being recorded. And now I'll hand you over to Sonal. Thank you.
Unmute. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Oh, Sonal, you've gone back on mute for some reason. That's it.
Yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be presenting today a glimpse of our findings from 21st Century Abattoir Review Project. I am Sonal Choudhary and I lead SDFC Food Network Project, where this whole conversation about 21st Century Abattoir began. We will be presenting as a team of two today, myself and Raymond, who is also SDFC Food Network Liaison for Food Policy and a lecturer at Manchester Alliance Business School. For some reason, it's a bit slow, the slides. Just bear with me. Okay. So just a quick outline of what to expect in today's webinar. We will be starting with the background on SDFC Food Network, then move on to 21st Century Abattoir Review Project, provide a quick overview of our findings, challenges we identified in our research, then we will zoom into FCI, food chain information, and its value for both FSA and businesses, and finally leave you all with some food for thoughts regarding the future of meat inspections. So I'll start with a bit of background on how this review was co-designed with SDFC Food Network and what is SDFC Food Network in the first place. So SDFC stands for Science and Technologies Facilities Council, and it focuses, it is one of the 9 UKRIs which mostly focuses on physics and space science research. SDFC has 3 campuses with space tech facilities in the UK, Harwell, Daresbury and Edinburgh, of which Harwell and Daresbury are the main big ones. Harwell is at outskirts of Oxford, where many of the scientists work on high-speed computing, different types of cutting-edge technologies, from remote sensing to drones, IoT sensors, IR thermography for heat sensing, cryogenics for quick freezing, to robotics. So Harwell also has facilities where different types of lights, such as electron beam light, neutrons, X-rays, gamma rays, etc., would penetrate the material for understanding its property and characteristics at molecular and atomic level. And we have used them for understanding varieties of food products as well. At Daresbury and Hartree Centre, which is between Manchester and Liverpool, many of the big data scientists work there and have capabilities of predictive big data analytics, AI, machine learning, image recognition, digital twins, quantum computing, and Hartree Centre facilities are shared by IBM and SDFC researchers. Now, many of these cutting-edge technologies and data science capabilities of SDFC are regularly applied for space science research, which is complex, but so is the food system, where complexities come from different inefficient processes and practices, different objectives of the actors in the food chain, data generated at each node of the food chain, but perhaps not utilized effectively and efficiently. So within this network, the research projects are co-designed by interdisciplinary researchers and industries and policymakers around burning food challenges under production, supply chain, manufacturing, consumers, and nutrition theme that affects different segments of the society where the capabilities of SDFC from data science, technologies, and facilities could be brought together towards addressing grand challenges that policy and businesses face in the food space. And one such challenge, food challenge, was identified at SDFC Food Network Conference through a keynote given by Professor Guy Poppy, that we still have 18th century abattoirs inspection processes, and there is a need to move towards a 21st century abattoirs. Now, we understand that before we took the review, we understood that UK meat industry is worth 4.4 billion a year to British economy. And it is challenging, highly competitive market. Before our review, we had a couple of roundtable discussions with FSA staff, chaired by Martin Evans, who has now moved on and enjoying his life. We found that while technological developments have rapidly accelerated other sectors, elements of meat processing industry have been slower to capitalize on new innovations, particularly in relation to the delivery of official controls. So we also came to know that abattoirs in the UK are highly variable, from small local slaughterhouses processing a handful of animals a week to industrial scale facilities processing thousands per day. However, in most of the cases, from smallest to biggest operations, the official control processes have hardly changed since Victorian times. So while abattoir workers and meat inspectors perform highly skilled functions, technology and data science has the potential to augment their capabilities, allowing them to more strategically target their attention and expertise and better protect consumers' food safety interests. Therefore, we came together as an interdisciplinary team to understand how we transition towards 21st century abattoir. What are the pain points that we need to address first? Our team from SDFC Food Network had 5 core members who conducted the review. Myself, sorry about my dog, myself and Ray. And you would be hearing from both of us today. 3 other members were Rakesh, Saeed, and Julie, all bringing different expertise and experiences from process, operations to supply chain and certification and consumer behavior. We were very much supported by key members of UKRI SDFC who were equally enthusiastic as us and wanted to see the pathways of transitioning towards 21st century food system and how SDFC could contribute towards addressing some of the challenges. We received constant support from Jeff, Catherine, and Tom from SDFC. And from FSA, we received a really constant support and guidance from Guy, Martin, and Ben. Now, it's a coincidence that all these three have now moved on. But besides them, there were many OBs and meat health inspectors on site who were very cooperative and helpful. We never felt like we didn't belong here. We were a part of FSA family, and I'm very happy to share the glimpse of our findings today with you all, and to actually get some suggestions as well from you towards the end. So the scope of the review was to understand as is process as a neutral party, so understanding the challenges from both FSA and FBO side, and identify critical control points and the challenges associated with delivery of official controls. Conduct absolutely and relative benchmarking. Let's say what's learning we should be transferring from poultry abattoirs to beef and pork. What we could learn from other countries or industries in terms of how we manage our time and resources more efficiently, how to ensure consumers trust in the food, and how to retain staff, and so on. The best practices for collecting and utilizing data, for not just for inspection, but for strategic surveillance, what type of data architecture, governance, virtual systems we need for 21st century abattoirs or food factory or food system, as one of the FBO's CEO would say. What cutting edge technologies and management practices could support FSA colleagues in efficient and effective delivery of official controls? And here I really want to stress that our review does not state that how we could replace some of the FSA staff, OVs or MHIs with technologies. Rather, it is more about how we could make their job less stressful, support them and manage the resources more efficiently. Example, some of the abattoirs had less inspectors than others. The right placement of the inspectors in the kill line, layout planning, etc. Yeah. And we have identified short-term, medium-term, long-term interventions from data, tech, management practices that could be useful for transitioning towards 21st century abattoirs. And not just abattoirs, inspections and operations, but we also touch upon supply chain and digital transformation, how we utilize tech and data could be used for monitoring animal welfare, certification, standards, packaging and labeling, and finally, how these interventions could help build UK FSA as a global brand that stands for pinnacle for quality. Now, our methodology actually consisted of brief Gemba walks in around 8 abattoirs in the UK and 2 abattoirs in Denmark for benchmarking, 10 roundtable group discussions with experts from FSA and FBOs, 30 plus follow-up interviews with FSA, SDFC, FBOs, farmers, multiple document analysis from academic grey literature containing both policy documents and the industry documents for understanding FSA inspection processes and benchmarking. And then this photo is from one of our visits to Two Sisters Food Group, and you can see Ranjit here participating in our roundtable discussion. Martin is behind the camera as usual, shying away, but there's a whole team who participated in the roundtable discussion. Our review covered both ante-mortem and post-mortem inspections. We went through all the different processes from both FSA's inspection side and FBO side. Identified 20 plus areas where we could work on and implement phase-wise changes at short, medium and long term. And today we will discuss one of the challenge areas, food chain information, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But this is just a fraction of what we covered in our report. From data science interventions. There are other interventions that we touch on from the different technologies and analytics for inspections, process efficiency, resource efficiency, human interventions as well from pest management practices. So if we were given an opportunity for taking you through all the opportunities and possible interventions we identified in our report, we'll probably be booked for food for thought webinars for at least a year. So today we'll be just covering FCI. Yeah. Now, before I hand over to Ray, who would be discussing potential of FCI, I would like to draw your attention back to SDFC Food Network and would like you to invite to our 4th annual conference next week, where we have Professor Robin May as a keynote speaker. Registration details are already provided here, and I will leave you with the link. And finally, at the conference, you will also hear from selected innovative scoping projects that the network has funded in the last 4 years. You can find more information about these projects on our website. I will leave you with the link again. Some of the projects would be of your interest, especially of FSA interest, such as eNose Campylobacter detection using space science technologies for detecting food fraud, food adulteration from honey to juices to wine, food policy impact simulator using digital twin, and digital twin for FSA's inspection is the next project we are working on. So hopefully we'll have a chance to interact with you all sometime soon again. Now over to Ray.
Thank you, Sonal, and thank you all for taking the time to listen to our webinar presentation today. With recent advances in digital database and network technologies and the growing precision of data analytics due to growing computing capabilities, data is the currency of the future. Not just in the incredible volumes of data that we can now generate and capture using these technologies, but also the variety of data that we can have access to and the way in which we can use these technologies to create value for businesses. When used correctly, data can be translated into information that can then be used analytically to generate great value for different processes. I'll be presenting today some of the findings from our transdisciplinary 21st century abattoir review. And like Sonal said, I'll be focusing specifically on how relevant streams of farm gate data can be incorporated as part of FCI reporting to improve the process and resource efficiency of risk-based meat inspections. So in principle, ante-mortem and post-mortem inspections rely on OV's assessment of FCI reports for potential risks that animals might present in terms of safety risks. But I'll be highlighting some of the challenges that we observed in terms of how the current FCI data is serving this purpose, i.e. aiding OVs make the kind of risk assessment that would allow them to partition or break down their inspection processes based on the risk probabilities of different herds. Subsequently, I'll be presenting our combined findings from our visits to abattoirs in Denmark and our benchmarking exercise on best practices of the use of farm gate data to inform FCI reporting for meat inspections from countries like the US and New Zealand, among others. So like I said, meat inspections are risk-based because OVs need to make these educated decisions on the spot about the safety of animals for slaughter, but they do this with the benefit of FCI data that accompanies the animal. The regulation stipulates that FCI could be delivered 24 hours in advance, but in most of the abattoirs that we visited in the UK, the data usually accompany the animals as they arrived, either in paper or digital form. While we did observe excellent adherence to the policies and the protocols for ante-mortem inspections once the animals arrive at the abattoirs, the challenge we found was that the ability to use the FCI information for risk-based assessment of the level of inspection scrutiny that the OVs need to apply as animals arrive was the primary concern that most OVs in the UK raised. Because OVs, in many cases, for example, in one of the largest abattoirs we visited where chicken is processed, have to observe large amounts of animals visually in line with risk-based inspections. So the idea is, how do we explore further ways to make sure that FCI data, rather than being a static piece of information that tells us demographic information, which is quite useful, but something that we can translate into something that provides value for inspectors in terms of improving inspection accuracy and reducing the burden in terms of resources required, as well as providing value for the FBOs as well, seen as they are having to grapple with tons of different conflicting and in some cases overlapping inspections to meet the requirements of different stakeholders. So all slaughterhouses and slaughterhouse operators by regulation request, receive and check and act on food chain information as part of the idea of this whole chain farm to fork approach to food safety. The FCI helps the slaughterhouse operators to implement food safety management systems like the HACCP, providing them with relevant information about animals that are procured for slaughter and details about how the animals were raised, where they were raised, and so on. In some cases, some of the information provided in the FCI are required by FBOs for commercial purposes. But since it captures things like health status, farm health, movement, and other such details, the FCI data or information should ideally inform decisions on whether or not to accept animals, if special provisions are to be made for the way the animals are to be processed, e.g. slaughtering specific batches in a certain way, or at the end of the day's run, or having additional dressing requirements, or reducing the speed line, and so on. There are three core oversight steps that involve the use of FCI data and as well the generation of feedback data from the FCI. So we observe these three steps to see whether or not the FCI plays a huge or at least a significant role in the activities that the OVs performed. First, the top-down assessment of the FCI document itself. And when the OVs receive the FCI document as the animals arrive, They assess, for relevant information on how the animals have been reared, the movement license, identification, number of animals, veterinary medicine withdrawal periods, and the health status of the animal, and so on. This kind of information allows the OVs to be able to look ahead and plan to adapt the slaughter operations to account for livestock that are likely to present potential health risks. The second area where the FCI information is used is once the animals arrive, the OVs will actually use the FCI to ensure that the animals tally with their numbers. But ideally, they should be able to use the same information to inform the visual ante-mortem inspections that they use to assess the animal's health and compliance with things like welfare regulations, both on farms and during transport. But in all the abattoirs we visited, we found that the FCI information didn't quite provide sufficient information for validating health and related measures. It was mostly used for correlating identity type measures and that sort of thing. Now, the next area is during post-slaughter now, the post-mortem inspection. And this allows OVs to be able to detect and condemn any and all carcasses that they deem to be unfit for human consumption due to either quality or safety issues. And again, at this stage, we found very minimal use of FCI or even mention of the FCI by OVs beyond issues around batch and demographic details of the batches that come from the farms. So we find that there are significant gaps in these three areas. But the final area is the bottom-up transmission of information or feedback of information through the communication of inspection reports, as the ante-mortem and post-mortem inspection reports, to farmers. We also found that there's somewhat of a disconnect between the FCI information and the communication of inspection reports, since the connection to ante-mortem and post-mortem is missing somewhat in the first place. So this is essentially the cycle of information. The FCI data plays somewhat a static role because it does not quite enable beyond batch traceability. It doesn't enable individual animal traceability. And in the current dispensation where we're in, where there's the tendency for us to start having delivery of livestock from different parts of the world, it's an essential capability that the FSA be able to detect animals to a specific livestock and then inform ante-mortem and post-mortem inspection safety regulations and limits in accordance with the analysis of FCI information and the reporting of feedback to farmers. So the entire inspection process is designed using the HACCP principle, like you're all aware. This implies that inspectors, like I said, use risk-based analysis, and they rely largely on visual checks. And the idea is that they're able to spot risks using the benefit of the knowledge that they've gathered from data, like the FCI data, and their experience. In very large abattoirs, however, particularly poultry and some pork abattoirs that we visited, this is a challenging endeavor, especially because most of the large poultry processing plants, particularly the one we visited, have now adopted new processing technologies that have increased the volumes of birds that they can process per batch. And this has likewise increased the strain on the inspectors that have to stand there and visually check these batches. And because the FCI information doesn't say much other than the identity of the batch, they are unable to use that information to inform the manner in which they inspect the batches as they arrive. So, in terms of the challenges that we identified, I'll start with the challenges from the OV's perspective. In the majority of the cases, farmers provided plausible information on things like health status, medication, test, disease profile, movement license, and all of that. And in nearly all the cases, we observed that the information that is provided to the official veterinarians, except for health status declarations, other categories would often fall under the nothing to declare. So they didn't quite feature into the inspection process, except for cases where, for example, the OV needed to apply particular scrutiny due to probably a mismatch in batch information or the numbering of the animals that were delivered and so on. Yet in other cases, we found that the FCI information captured actually by the farmers were either invalid or in some cases non-response. And although there are strict protocols in place for ensuring that when there are cases of invalid information or non-responses, that there are ways that these are addressed before animals are cleared for slaughter. The implication is that the FCI documentation was in large part not found to make significant contributions, if any, to the way in which ante-mortem inspections and post-mortem inspections were informed. Several official veterinarians also explained to us that the FCI could, in principle, help them to be able to deploy robust scoring systems that would allow them to support decision rules about how to scrutinize certain batches during ante-mortem inspections and whether to pay attention to certain batches for post-mortem inspections. However, to be effective, for FCI information to be this effective, such a scoring system must be data-driven, and it must provide the OBs with extra information to aid them in allocating batches of animals to the right inspection procedures and in using their resources optimally and efficiently. Now, in terms of the FBOs, the majority of the FBOs that we reviewed, including those that manage their own farms, noted that farmers, particularly when dealing with smallholders, seem to have different types of difficulties in capturing, documenting, and providing specific information for the FCI. Like Sonal mentioned, our research was transdisciplinary, involving industry and different disciplinary expertise. So we had explorations into the human side of things. But I'm just focusing here on the capture of FCI information. It was noted that certain times the information was not correctly captured, and there were concerns from the FBOs that the FCI information as currently gathered had shortcomings in terms of the quality of the data gathered by farmers and the standards for reporting the data across different farms. These shortcomings affect the value that the FCI can provide in terms of supporting risk-based inspections. And except for, sorry, oh my God. Sorry, I'm sorry. Except for information around, say, the kill sheet data, the one that's communicated back to the farmers about the weight, the grade, the price, and that kind of information relating to a batch, the farmers seldom used or received any information based off of the FCI that can directly inform their own productivity in terms of improving their efficiency, or can help them improve the efficiency of inspections of their animals in the future. And in many cases, when incidences were flagged, although farmers do take corrective action to respond to incidences flagged from the communication of inspection reports, the details of the data provided to farmers were insufficient, and in many cases in disparate warehouses or silos, as we like to call them, such that they were not able to support the sort of predictive and preventive analytics, particularly around measures that affect FBO productivity and the FSA's efficiencies in inspections. So what we sought to do then was to kind of, from our benchmarking of other systems, see the extent to which farm gate data is used to inform inspections and how new technologies can enable the capture of relevant data that can provide indications or indicators about animal safety and quality and welfare, such that it can benefit the process of ante-mortem and post-mortem inspections, improve the efficiency, and utilize the rare and experienced OB resources, put them to better use. So in terms of value, we set out to define value of inspections from the point of view of the OBs and from the FSA. Now, the OBs are after results, reducing the incidences of contamination in meat products, but they're also after the process, ensuring that they're rigorous in following the legislation. But in combining these two with the old system of visual inspection, palpations, and incisions where necessary, without the benefit of data that is driving these processes, we find that there's quite a lot by way of expenditure in the UK in terms of OB costs for abattoir inspections, and quite a lot of effort, like I explained, on the part of the OBs. From the point of view of the abattoirs and the farmers, value had more, for the farmers specifically, value had more to do with gathering data around things like breeding, feeding, and welfare information that would help them improve their results in terms of aligning to what the abattoirs require of them and to market needs, as well as meeting performance measures of for their livestock in terms of inspections. For the abattoirs, the value from FCI data for them was mostly around using farm gate information efficiently to improve their own ability to meet safety and welfare requirements. Now, welfare requirements were popping up in most of the abattoirs we visited. And it's interesting because although it is not mandated in any way by legislation to be captured and reported, it is now one of those streams of data that is emerging to become a policy-driven stream of data that in the very near future might be mandatory to report to consumers. So capturing these kinds of data and communicating them efficiently was the priority of abattoirs. So in order to be able to align these priorities, it's important that the data streams that are gathered and generated as the food chain information should provide these actors value to meet their independent objectives. So from our review, we then set about to review, we visited Denmark, after benchmarking Denmark across the world with different abattoirs for their data management and official inspection delivery processes, as well as other regions in the world, like I mentioned, the US, New Zealand, and so on. We identified 5 pathways that these different agencies and different countries and jurisdictions use to unlock FCI value by using existing or scalable technologies like air tags and RFID codes, as well as motion technologies and vision and imaging technologies. And these pathways are, number 1, they digitize baseline animal performance matrix. They select a baseline animal performance matrix for each animal category, and they digitize them and transfer them alongside the animals. Digitizing baseline feed intake information. That's the second value stream. Digitizing livestock productive capacity by species and breed. Digitizing livestock welfare monitoring, creating a matrix of values that you follow from farm all the way through to slaughter. And digitizing the post-mortem inspection and quality grading processes themselves. So I'll talk briefly about these different pathways. And the idea here is not that every region has mastered all pathways. Like I said, this is a coalition of different ideas. Different regions have strengths in certain pathways and less so in others. So this is like a full picture of the full spectrum of how FCI data can be augmented for the 21st century. In terms of digitizing a baseline animal performance matrix, we observed that in jurisdictions like in Denmark, they have regulatory requirements to digitize certain baseline performance measures like birth weight, weaning, and mortality, maternal milk, mature livestock size, and quite a number of parameters that give you an indication of the value of the animal itself. And the idea is that by generating vast amounts of these kinds of data and having them accompany the animal from farms through to slaughter, they are able to model potential susceptibilities of certain herds, for example, as well as model certain market value benefits of certain herds or certain locations for sourcing animals that will be beneficial both for the FSA and for the FBOs. They used simple technologies. They use simple technologies like RFID chips, in some cases tattoos and air tags to inform the movement of this data. And it has several value streams that it generates for different actors. For example, such data, digitizing a baseline animal performance matrix, can inform livestock pricing contracts, different ways for negotiating pricing arrangements between farmers and abattoirs, which was one of the main challenges that we identified in our review, which I think is a major challenge in the food industry in the UK that's contributed to the government paying quite a lot to keep farmers going. So having a system of that monitors performance and informs farmers about how their animals might perform can give incentives for developing futures types of contracts and informing other types of payment and financing alternatives like invoice factoring and forfeiting and so on. These sorts of things are quite relevant now. As we all know, the Rural Payment Agency is trying to develop a new payment scheme for farmers. And so it's important to understand the type of measures that we can capture once and for all, just alongside FCI, that can inform those kind of benefits and also incentivize farmers to capture data that will be relevant for inspection purposes. The second stream or pathway of data that can be used to augment FCI is capturing or digitizing a baseline feed intake information. Now, food chain information ideally should capture measures of animal food intake and metabolism, particularly with the incidences of feed additives and recurrent debates around the health and safety benefits of different feeding regimes. It's important to be able to use that kind of data to predict potential health and nutrition deficiencies that may make animals susceptible to certain conditions. In the US and in New Zealand, these sorts of data are now currently being gathered and captured, and in some cases mandated as part of FCI information that follows the animal through to slaughter, so that these sorts of predictive analytics can be run to improve the quality and the risk-based nature of ante-mortem and post-mortem inspections. They're even considering using these streams of data along with other data streams to standardize the production sizes, for example, of animals, so that you can make cuts more amenable to imaging technologies that can then be used for post-mortem inspections. But baseline feed intake information like feed category, average daily gain, total digestible nutrients, comparative feed value, and so on, provide valuable information that can improve farmers' cost efficiency and feedlot management, improve ante-mortem inspection accuracy by reducing the resource intensity of ante-mortem inspections, particularly in big abattoirs, minimize the duplication of inspections by government standards and other agencies. As we observed, many of the abattoirs complained because they had several inspection regimes that they had to keep up with. And so having all of this in one place, as is done in some of these places that we visited and benchmarked, helps reduce the tendency for having to deal with all these different inspections. It also supports the idea of developing a metric for the government's plans around improving transparency with respect to what we feed our animals towards a more sustainable UK. The new payment scheme for farmers is set to award to give rewards to farmers who can display or demonstrate sustainable practices. And having a digitized way of capturing feeding practices and so on can be a good measure that will be applied or applicable in that sense. The third stream is digitizing livestock productive capacity by species and breed. Now, there's tons of DNA traceability technologies that are now being applied, the most reliable being genetic marking techniques, and others being morphological labeling, cytological labeling, and biochemical marking, and so on. In Denmark, this has been applied extensively, where they now use digital registers of individual animals' genetic traceability using match probabilities to be able to trace animals not just to batches, but to individual animals, and hosted on a system where the OVs can have access to it. Analytics can be run to model, the historical trajectories of certain breeds from certain farms, certain regions, so that OVs can plan inspections and that sort of thing. So there are tons of measures that are captured in terms of productive capacity, and these measures are also transmitted using existing technologies like GPS air tags, IoT, smart sensors, RFID chips, tattoos, QR codes, and so on. In terms of value, this will help in the evaluation of production system alternatives, as well as the health implications and inspection implications of different production systems. Making those kinds of informed decisions would require that the OVs have relevant data and the relevant analytics running behind an integrated system that allows them make these kinds of risk-based decisions with respect to inspections. Thereby, rather than changing or replacing the OV's job, it is modifying the OV's job to becoming something a bit more strategic. For example, in Denmark, we had a case where there's one OV on the floor and several other OVs running analytics in the background to pick up things about certain breeds or about certain batches that are arriving that may flag concerns for more scrutiny. The next stream is digitizing livestock welfare monitoring. So things like absence of prolonged hunger, thirst, comfort, ease of movement, absence of disease, injuries, and so on. Now, in most of the abattoirs we visited, this is primarily done by visual inspections. And I have to say, because of how experienced the OVs are, they're able to spot animals that are out of place. But when you're looking at really large herds, and particularly species that are processed in massive quantities like birds, it becomes quite difficult to be able to track these different elements of welfare that would indicate, the need for more scrutiny at later stages of inspection. In some of the benchmark studies and the sites that we visited, we found extensive applications of these technologies, like real-time location systems used to detect the position of animals and infer their activity, kinetic cameras used to detect aggression in pigs specifically, sound recording to detect vocalizations of animals and use that to kind of infer their welfare, although there are arguments as to whether that particular technique is efficient. But the interesting thing is that they combine a couple of these techniques, in many cases using the same technology. So a typical example is the use of non-invasive infrared thermography cameras at the farm gate and at the layerage to monitor the welfare and to detect early disease in animals. And we saw this applied in Denmark, where they had these cameras mounted at the layerage. As soon as the animals come in and they are monitored on the system, and in the background, there's an image analytics taking place where the OVs are running the analytics and watching the images and using the benefit of historic images to be able to detect, incidences that would warrant further attention. So the use of this kind of technologies shows how you can augment both existing OV capacities and improve the ability to execute inspections using fewer resources, but using the available resources efficiently. The last pathway that I'll discuss is the digitization of post-mortem inspections and quality grading. Now, while this is not within the scope of the data flow process of the FCI, it's quite interesting to just talk about some of the things that we saw in this area. So we found the extensive use of ultrasonic imaging that integrates the merit of computer vision and spectroscopy techniques to be able to generate spectral images that will give information about the quality and grade of meat, but also give you information about the potential hazards that might be present in a particular sample of meat. So we also saw tomographic imaging, things like X-ray imaging, magnetic resonance imaging, used to replace, the laborious process of carcass inspections, particularly in very large abattoirs. Optical imaging, like fluorescence imaging, Ramden imaging, hyperspectral imaging, replacing manual visual palpation and incision procedures for offal inspection. And we also saw the use of odor and thermal imaging for freshness and freeze death in inspections to support export certification. These types of technologies that allow us to revolutionize the way in which ante-mortem and post-mortem inspections are executed by abattoirs, by OVs in abattoirs, would reduce the workload and improve inspection reporting in terms of speed and accuracy, as well as the value of the communication of inspection reports to farmers. It will also improve meat quality verification by the abattoirs and retailers. So in other words, it has business as well as regulatory benefits. So in essence, what we found is that to move towards the 21st century of smart inspections, it is crucial that inspections not only rely on the quality of data for corrective actions, but also the quality of the analytics that can be run using such data so that they can run predictive decisions around how inspections are to be run. So in terms of the chain, the value chain of food chain information data, converting from, adding all these data streams from the farm gate and creating a new way of looking at food chain information. We start by looking at food chain information data as providing us the opportunity to have risk-based assessment and value-based assessment and categorizations of different farms across the UK. And by having that kind of categorization, the FCI allows us then to be able to set intensity measures for meat inspection procedures, for example, whether we need visual-only inspections for low-risk animals, or whether we need more stringent inspection procedures for high-risk animals, and so on. And in that sense, it informs decisions around how carcass treatment, around how additional carcass inspections will be run if necessary, and so on. So in addition to having this feed forward of information that drives corrective action to the point where the prioritization of the measures that we are now looking at as control measures is collaboratively done by farmers, abattoirs, and other players in the food chain. That's quite crucial because, like I mentioned earlier, welfare is going to become one of the main areas worth paying attention to for the 21st century. And the availability of technologies that would allow inspectors to be able to demonstrate this with FCI information will set the UK meat production industry ahead of its peers using a minimal investment in heavy gadgetry and technologies and all of that. Likewise, when that kind of information is gathered in volume, we are now better able to run the sort of predictive analytics that countries that have used this kind of system for a long protracted period of time can now do. So the idea is not to try and tackle all the different pathways, but to focus on certain pathways and try to develop a data landscape and then build in the resources and investments required to expand data capture for that particular pathway, as well as data transmission to inform inspections. So how do we enable smart inspections for the future? Like I said, we need to, first of all, run studies that understand the current data challenges, requirements, and the technologies that will be used to translate the different data streams, any particular one of the FSA's choosing, into information that is valuable for ante-mortem and post-mortem inspection. As we observed, depending on the size of the abattoir and the scale of production, abattoirs collect information at different levels. Some of them are at high levels of collection and aggregation, but very low levels of utilization. In most cases, most of them are low levels of impact in terms of how they use farm gate data to inform inspection and processes. So a rigorous study around understanding the FCI data-driven value chain is one of the areas that the SDFC Food Network, our partners and the different actors, both in the food industry and the policy space, are starting to conceptualize, and we would very much welcome more contributors from the FSA to shed light on how we can expand this around any one of the given measures that I've highlighted here today. Other areas worth considering is the idea of big data management. So we noticed that some of the data streams that I've highlighted for the different pathways already exist, but in different silos run by different government agencies and departments like DEFRA, APHA, FSA, and so on. So what is quite expedient right now is a big data interoperability framework that allows these different agencies to pool the relevant data streams and combine them in useful ways that can then be translated and transmitted alongside FCI to generate value for inspections. So this will entail developing some kind of standard interoperability framework for an end-to-end FCI data chain that combines different data sources from the key agencies, from the FBOs, and provides definitions, taxonomies, use cases, requirements, security and privacy, and data architecture, and all of that for all the different actors, as well as technology roadmaps so that new technologies can be incorporated for more data capture as the technology space expands. Other areas for potential opportunities for expanding is creating value around how meat inspections, particularly for export certification, is done, and around how value is generated for the FSA in terms of resource use and quality of output, and the HMRC in terms of remittances. So with the capabilities in the SDFC, we're exploring opportunities for validating a data platform for taxation and remittance around meat export, and something around the export certification itself for meat. For example, developing a smart contract infrastructure, that's underpinned by a trust framework, cybersecurity, and a privacy framework to support meat exports. In this regard, I'll note here that the FSA has recently put out a data trust framework, and we think that this will be quite useful for exploring any one of these pathways for expanding FCI data collection. So in closing, I'll just reiterate that data is central to driving value for modern companies and driving value for the development of policy and for assuring the safety and the quality of meat produce in the UK. So it's essential that we start to grapple with these new ways of improving the value that we can generate from existing data streams and from the capture of new and imaginative data streams that would improve both the inspection quality, the use of FSA resources, and the value that accrues from inspections to the FBOs. Quick reminder again that our 4th annual conference for the SDFC Food Network will run from the 13th to the 14th of July from 9 to 12. And the registration link I've included there. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Sonal. Thank you, Raymond. Thank you very much for the talk, and I think we all agree was generally really interesting. We have a few minutes and a few questions here in the chat. I'm gonna go in order, so not to miss any question. The first one we have is from Julie, and she said, how much, if any, discussion has there been with the livestock information program to date? Have any discussion with the livestock information program?
Sorry, I'm not sure I caught the question. Sorry, could you please?
Oh, yeah, sure. So how much discussion has there been with the livestock information program, if there has been like discussion?
So no, we've not had any direct discussions with the livestock information program, although it got flagged up a few times, particularly when we visited the one of the abattoirs that has a fully integrated system where they own their farms, they own the abattoirs, and they have reasonable oversight of the retail end. So it did come up, but we during the scope of this particular review, we didn't have any direct engagement. But it's a very welcome idea, because like I said, we're currently looking at developing opportunities for expanding the value of FCI, and I'm sure they've done significant work as well. So those kinds of collaborations are quite necessary.
Yeah, great. We have a comment from Jose, I hope it's correct. It's mostly just it's not really a question, but more like a comment. And agree that FCI is a very good concept, but it says its value depends on the quality and its quality. So as the norm will be to provide just the bare minimum information, because it's a legal requirement to provide it, rather than aiming to provide anything useful out of it. And industry are also reluctant to ask for anything more than the minimum data. So to avoid having to make decisions as to whether to accept animals, process them differently. So
yeah. So just a quick comment on that. During our review, we noticed that there are 3 regimes around how the FCI is viewed. So from the central point, which is the abattoir, FCI is viewed as some sort of standardization document, meaning that they use this to meet up to the regulatory requirements, as the person who posted the question or comments rightly noted. But then the FCI has other applications. For example, it can, if other streams of data are added to what is collected as FCI, generate efficiency value from the farm gate, as well as responsiveness value from the retail end. So responding to what consumers need and what types of data need to be captured, as well as improving the efficiency of what is happening at the farms so that inspections can be improved. Unfortunately, the current legislative framework is centered around inspections of abattoirs and completely overlooks what's happening at the farms and what's happening in the retail end. And part of the reason for this conversation is to kind of steer the policy direction to start looking at efficiency value and responsiveness value in addition to the reporting value for standardization.
Yeah, agree. And actually, I'm going to jump one question because there another one relevant. And based on what you say, who decides what data is actually available, and what's the driver? And so, for instance, is it quality driven or food safety or animal health? And then we have like a second question, but just based on that.
Yes. Sonal, will you
I'll
like
decide
to?
that. Sorry, I couldn't hear that. No, just then who decides what data in the end is actually available, and who decide which one to keep essentially, or what's the driver behind this data?
Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, no, go on, Sonal.
No, so again, it depends. Like some of the data it sits with FBOs, and it's the system I would say which decides how data is shared between among the different actors. And at the moment, there are different agencies sitting with the different kinds of data, different types of data, which are not talking to each other. So this is why we are having this conversation, that there are varieties of data out there. However, we need to start seeing how the data are interacting between one, like sitting with one system to another system. So yeah, at the moment, it is the individual parties, the FBOs, and let's say the FSA has certain amount of data, DEFRA has certain amount of data, APHA would have certain amount of data, but it's not interacting at the moment.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, just to add to that, the data that is being collected, to your second question, is mostly driven by safety measures. And these safety measures obviously are underpinned by policy. And so the actors are only compelled to collect these safety data, the one that's currently reported in the FCI. But when you start looking at the data that is available in other pockets, like Sonal highlighted, it becomes immediately obvious that the FCI can actually be used to generate other types of value, such as quality value, efficiency value, and so on, which also feature into the safety measures that the standard reporting is aiming to achieve. So the long and short of it is, with the current policy focus, there needs to be some kind of opening up around what is possible in terms of how data can be generated and gathered to augment what currently exists, and how that data can then be used analytically to improve inspections.
Okay. And now that you mentioned FBOs and farm and so on, is every actor clear about the responsibility and how it's split between like industry, like businesses, FBOs and farms, and like the government? Like, it's the other thing that everybody's clear on that, or find sometimes issues with the responsibilities and stuff?
In terms of the data itself, there is some clarity around certain data streams about, say, for example, data streams that the local authorities control and the ones that DEFRA is in charge of, and FSA and so on. But I think the bigger question around the point that you're making is who controls the relevant streams of data that can help improve the value of FCI. And currently at the moment, it's several actors. And that is why we welcomed very happily the recent publication by the FSA around thinking about data trust for safety. That is establishing something of a fiduciary type of data trust not run or owned by any one of the actors, but the different contributors come together and have discussions around what data they need to pull from their different databases and use in a certain way to generate value. That kind of conversation is what we need to, reduce, the conversation around silos, because I'm sure the conversation around silos of data is one that most people are already kind of, aware of and know about. But what is taking us forward now is these new emerging ideas of thinking of data trust, where the FSA, APHA, AHDB, DEFRA, the FBOs, and different farmers, local authorities can all contribute different streams of data, generate funds, and transfer that data because they've all decided and determined the value stream to each actor. So yeah, the data trust, I think, is one of the ways that we can rationalize that challenge.
Yeah, and just to add to that, when we are talking about the data trust, we are not just talking at like a system level interactions or the system level interoperability. So it's not just only about the technicalities of how would you share and how the data should be shared and how the trust could be maintained, but it is also about the behavioral aspect, the aspect that Ray has very rightly pointed out in terms of value. So what's the value associated with each different actors to produce the data and to use the data?
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We're slightly overrun, so we have just one last question from Jose. Again, he says, where animal identity is not based on the individual animals themselves, but as a herd, how can FSI, feature information, be relevant for batches of animal from different sources? So he says, livestock markets that mix the animals. Also like from various farms.
So yeah, that's a valid point, because much of what we observed is batch level traceability. But in our exploration of the different abattoirs, we found that there are some hacks in some cases and some advanced technology interventions that abattoirs have used to narrow down traceability to individual animals. So for example, in one of the abattoirs we visited in Denmark, they didn't have an elaborate technology, but they just had a labeling system that is used to label the animal, a digitized labeling system. As the animal comes in, it's assigned a label that is then put on the hoist that the animal is used, that affixes the animal to the slaughter line. And that follows the animal almost throughout its journey. And in that sense, if the line has to be stopped, it is easy to track back in terms of number of packs along the processing line, where one animal stops and where another starts. In the UK, for example, in some of our discussions with farmers, we found that when incidences are flagged, a whole batch of animals may have to be condemned. So with a simple hack like that, a little bit digitized, but some little innovation around how the production line is set up, individual animal traceability can be possible. Also, there are more advanced, like the ones I talked about, where you're using DNA type techniques to trace animals and then use RFID tattoos to affix on certain parts of the animal where normal animal markings will go. So we saw this applied, and there are several regions as well where it is being trialed. So there are adventures, if you like, going on into how individual animal traceability can be done. And we think that this is ample time for the FSA to start exploring some of these measures, as traceability down to individual animals is becoming a crucial measure.
Absolutely. I think this gave a lot of food for thought for a lot of people, and on new ideas that could be explored. I think a lot of people would have probably have a lot of questions, and they might, if you agree, probably they ask you a few more questions by email, I imagine, because when I think it was really interesting. Okay, I think I'm just checking here again in the chat, but I think there are not any more questions here, and no, just want to say thank you both very much for a really interesting talk, and looking forward to know more about it and where this innovation goes. in the future, hopefully. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining us and listening to the talk. And I'm sure you all agree it was really interesting. And thank you, Sonal and Raymond, again.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone, then. Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Bye.